Welcome back, everyone. Adam Lafacci, your moderator, rejoining you, and thanks so much for joining us for this second session today in the Time and Navigation Online Conference, Meeting the Challenges and Inventing the Future. Now, if you missed our first session today, the Time-Place Connection, don't worry, we're recording it so you can watch it anytime you want. We'll have that posted usually within 1 to 2 days of the end of the conference, but we may even have that up on the site by the end of today, so keep an eye on the conference site, and we'll be sure to post that as soon as possible. We are thrilled to have Roger Connor joining us now from the National Air and Space Museum, and I'm going to turn the floor over to him to kick off our second session.
Thank you, Adam. My name, as Adam said, is Roger Connor. I'm the Air Navigation Curator here at the National Air and Space Museum. And I think we'll start off by a poll here, and that's who controls GPS? So please take a vote there, and we'll see what everybody thinks.
Great, and you'll all notice that you can click the gray bubble that best corresponds to your answer, and it does seem like we've had a few responses coming in already. It looks like our leader is the United States Air Force, followed by the UN.
Yeah, so, okay, very good, everybody. That's absolutely correct. So the U.S. Air Force is the agency that actually controls GPS. So GPS was a military satellite system. And while there's not a United Nations that controls satellite navigation, there are groups of nations that work together, and so the United States actually helps lead that. So while it's actually the Air Force that operates GPS, there is a group in the United States government that helps other nations work together to create systems that are what they call interoperable, which means that if you get a GPS signal, you can also use, say, the Russian signal or the Chinese signal or the European signal. And so this is a big problem. If everybody has a different frequency and your receiver can only use one and not the others, then everybody else in the world is poorer for it. So getting everybody on the world on the same page is a big deal, even though it's actually the U.S. Air Force that controls it. So to start off, we're looking at this picture of a shipwreck here. And 400 years ago, if you got lost, that often meant death. In less than an hour, you could be sailing along in clear skies, the wind could come up and push you onto the rocks, and it was pretty much all over. And so the real trick was to get into a position where this wasn't likely to happen. Unfortunately, sailing for governments or for commerce or whatever the reason was an all-weather year-round occupation, and so this was unfortunately a very common occurrence. About 300 years ago, people that today we might call scientists or engineers began working on some technical solutions of how to figure out position a lot better, rather than just, say, sailing in a westerly direction. And today, of course, we don't have to worry about getting blown onto a lee shore, as they called, getting smashed on the rocks. But we do have to worry about things as minor as trying to find where we put our iPhone. And, of course, we have an app for that. But the process by which we've gotten to the point where we can do that is pretty much the same process that those mariners and the governments that funded those ships many centuries ago, they followed. So it really comes down to the big question of how do we innovate to find the solutions to these really big problems that are really life and death. And so the big question here is, it's one thing to avoid a shipwreck or another type of accident, but how do we get across the ocean to sell our product in a way that our competitors don't? Sometimes unfortunately, in today's world, it comes down to how can we bomb our enemy before they bomb us? So national power has really been defined in a large part by these technologies for finding place. And of course, the GPS satellites that guide our cars, our airplanes, or our smartphone apps, these systems in no small measure are dependent upon having outstanding clocks. They have atomic clocks, 4 atomic clocks on each of those GPS satellites. And those clocks not only provide our navigation for all those things, but they also synchronize the cell phone networks that we depend on. If somebody jams GPS signals, it's not just that you can't find your way anymore, it's that your cell phone, within about a half hour's time, is going to stop working. Our power grid is based off those signals. Jamming GPS can interrupt the power grid. if you were to do it on a large scale. And unfortunately, jamming GPS is actually a fairly easy thing to do, at least on a local level. So this is a big deal. Stock trades, Wall Street, bank transactions, all that uses the GPS time signals to synchronize their process. And so we've put all this national effort into this idea of finding place as well as time. And right now it's a big question as to how we deal with this vulnerability. So process of innovation is never done. It's one thing to create these systems that solve problems, but these solutions in turn create their own problems. So we've talked a little bit about why these things are important, but let's kind of clarify some of these issues here. So national power is obviously a very big one. If you go back to the 1500s, Spain was the world power. Why was Spain the world power? It's because they could get their ships across the ocean. Same thing with the Dutch. Holland in the 1600s, same thing. They were able to take control of the seas and really kind of set the standard in terms of getting around. And because of that, they became the world power. Britain in the 1800s, or the 1700s, same story. America in the 1900s started to become a global power because it could get around the world a little bit better than others could. So in our case, it was because our clipper ships knew how to map the currents in the ocean. So being able to know where you are and where the current is gives you an advantage. So we could navigate around South America better than other nations could. And so we were able to create a new trading route that others didn't have access to. It's not just questions of military power, and we've just talked about commerce, but the ability to navigate airliners, for instance, more efficiently has huge impacts that go beyond just simply an advantage over another country. If you can get an airliner into an airport faster, you're going to burn less fuel, you're going to have less emissions, so you're going to create a greener economy if you can have a better navigation. Of course, the more fuel you burn over the long term, the higher the gas prices are going to be because you're burning more oil. So to be able to do things more efficiently by navigation has huge impacts on our society, well beyond just simply getting goods from A to B faster. Of course, a big thing is the social implications of being able to get around the world. And navigation has greatly impacted things like immigration. So a lot of people have ancestry that comes from across the Atlantic Ocean, and so the ability to move those people, and of course that's for better or worse. The Atlantic slave trade was also enabled by these things, just as the ability of immigrants from Eastern Europe to escape persecution. So there's always positives and negatives associated with these things. But the point is that these technologies have a huge impact on our daily life. One of the critical questions here is what challenges have really motivated the nations to invest in these things. So we've kind of talked about the big ideas, but let's see if you have some specific thoughts about a particular example where countries have felt they really needed to push these kind of technologies. So either for military power or for commerce or something to improve society. What do you think are the things that are really pushing this right now? So one of the ways that we can improve things, we've talked about why this stuff's important. So how do we actually affect change? So let's say we've realized as a nation we have this problem that we need to be able to get around the world in a better way. So what are the ways that we try to inspire people? Now, if you think about your local science fair, it's a competition, and competitions are a very powerful way of getting inventors and companies to think of new ways of doing things and to get an edge on the competition. So the science fair, of course, the motivation there is that you get a basically you have your own pride in winning the process. But some of you may have a sibling that's in college that's participated in some sort of engineering competition. There's competitions to design a better robot to navigate a course, or to create a self-driving car, or that sort of thing. And those kind of competitions become very important, of course, for the people, the students that participate in them, because it can get them a better job. So there's an incentive there. But outside of the academic environment, one of the big advantages for these competitions are big prize monies. So, for instance, back in the early 1700s, the British Navy had a horrible accident. They had several thousand sailors killed due to a particular shipwreck, and they realized that they needed to avoid that kind of problem in the future. So they gave a huge pot of money to anyone that could invent a solution to that problem. And in today's dollars, depends on how you calculate it, but it could have been upwards of about $300 million prize. So they were giving out real money to try and encourage somebody to invent a solution to that problem. And if you've heard the last session where they talked about the Harrison chronometer, that's one of those innovations that came out of it. And we still do this, countries still do this today. So a big one in the recent past was the DARPA Grand Challenge. So the Pentagon, through the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, funded an effort to create a self-driving vehicle that could go around a big course in the desert and navigate itself. And the reason, of course, that the Pentagon wants to do this is they want to be able to have convoys that don't have drivers in them, and that way, if there's an insurgent or terrorist attack on a vehicle convoy, you don't have the drivers getting injured because it's just a robot that's doing the driving. And so that process, though, then was open to universities in terms of having a big money prize out there to encourage this sort of innovation.
To jump back to one of your earlier questions of what challenges have motivated nations to create new navigational technologies, one of the big ones in American history, at least, is the discovering of America by Europeans. When all of that travel started, was that a major push for developing new navigational techniques, or by that point were a lot of the things already established?
No, absolutely. So unfortunately, the navigational techniques were still fairly primitive at that time. So if we go back to say the early 16th century, Columbus's era, the primary navigational method was essentially to sail west. They could pretty much do that fairly well, but you couldn't do much more than that. So where the Spanish wound up in a lot of cases was where their ships wound up. It's where the winds blew them. So in a lot of ways, the way that our country is defined today by, say, our origin as an English colony comes about because that's where the currents took us, rather than necessarily where we would have wanted to go. So, for instance, England, one of the reasons that England takes an interest in North America, and this is where the idea of the Pilgrims fleeing for religious persecution is a little bit misleading. But the thing that was really driving England to sea in those years was really what we might call piracy today. The English knew that the Spanish were moving a lot of money in the form of gold from Central and South America, and they knew that if they wanted to cash in, the best way was to take it from the Spanish. So the English saw opportunities in creating colonies in North America, basically as jumping off points to try and get their hands on some of that Spanish gold. So that's where these technologies really kind of start to shape things. And a lot of what happened in those centuries came about not because they had the good tools to go where they wanted, but because the tools weren't very good, and so they had to stick to certain routes. In the case of the Spanish, it worked out fairly well for them because the winds essentially took them to where the gold was, but that was really more coincidence than anything else. So a lot of these things are accidents of history. So it really wasn't until the kind of middle 1800s that you really start to see the big advantages in navigational technology start to come into play, and that's the point where you can start doing things like mapping the Pacific Ocean and mapping where the currents are. And that story is really important to the rise of the United States as an economic power relative to the rest of the world, because we could now get around the world in a way that was a little bit more efficient than some of our competitors.
That's great, thank you. And, it's interesting. Before you were touching on some of those major motives for different countries, being things like trade and military and exploration. And it occurs to me now, as you're breaking this down, that maybe piracy is the intersection of all three.
Absolutely. Uh, and in fact, I, I think piracy in particular is kind of an interesting one, because to be a pirate essentially means you have to kind of navigate off the grid. You have to go further out than the people that you're going to be robbing from, in a way. So you have to navigate further and farther. And so, in the case of England and, say, Australia, why were the English interested in Australia? Well, one of the reasons you find out is because a lot of the early English explorers that were looking in that part of the world were looking for jumping off bases where they could attack Portuguese or Spanish ships that were operating out of the Central Pacific. So ships coming out of the Philippines or South Asia, the British saw that they put colonies or bases down towards Australia, they'd be able to sneak in and out and attack those other ships. So piracy in its own way has actually been a powerful motivator for creating new technologies. And certainly a pirate, it would probably be more motivated than anybody else to adopt a new quadrant or a compass or that type of technology. So unfortunately, the kind of illegal activity is often a big motivator for people to adopt these things. You probably find that in our recent past, one of the first groups to adopt GPS were smugglers, so drug runners or whoever. But they were one of the early adopters for GPS technology.
It's interesting to hear, because I think in pop culture we most often think of pirates as swashbucklers in a lot of the movies, but not usually as maybe being some advanced navigators and possibly on the cutting edge of technology at that time in regards to that as well.
Absolutely. So anybody that's kind of striking off on their own, crossing oceans, is really going to put themselves at a lot of risk if they don't get it right. So they had a pretty big incentive to get it right.
Thank you.
So the one of the big ways that we solve this problem of innovation today is by getting everybody to work together. So this means national institutions, so everybody from the Pentagon to the National Institute of Science and Technology. Universities, of course, are conducting a lot of experiments. Corporations and companies are doing it. But the big thing is the partnership. So it's getting all these people to play nice together that are really kind of critical to making things happen. And I mentioned earlier the international partnerships that are so critical to getting things working on a international level. But when you get down to it, one of the really great motivators, besides piracy, is disaster. So we mentioned a little bit before that the British had a really bad day back in 1707 that motivated that prize to find new ways of determining longitude. And it was this episode in the Scilly Isles where Admiral Chevelle, that we see here in the picture, kind of arrogantly assumed that he was a lot further west than he actually was, and the ships run onto these little islands that are off the southwest coast of England. And so, like I said, killed about 2,000 people, sank the English flagship, and killed Admiral Chevelle as part of it. And so that kind of disaster really is a very powerful motivator. So if you're losing a big portion of your fleet due to some bad weather, then you're going to be pretty motivated to find a solution to that. So disasters have been a very powerful motivator. Another one of these in more recent years came in 1983. So in 1983, there was a Korean airliner that made a navigational error. They basically just didn't turn a switch in the cockpit of the airliner to the right mode, and because of that, they wandered into the airspace of the Soviet Union. And the Soviets later claimed that they thought the airplane was an American spy plane. They should have been able to presumably verify that it was not. Anyway, they shot it down and killed all on board. And so President Reagan at that time took the opportunity to say, okay, we're developing this new GPS system for our military, but we're going to open it up to the entire world. So anybody in the world can use our GPS system. And of course, he did that as a way of drawing a huge distinction between the Soviets, who were shooting down civilian airliners, and then the United States, which were then making good and opening up a military system to the great benefit of the rest of the world. So that was, of course, a great publicity coup for the United States to be able to say that. And of course, while it's possible that the GPS would have been a civilian system anyway that everybody in the world would have used sooner or later, just the very fact that this accident kind of pushed that out into the open really made it much more of a reality faster, I think, because that occurred. And an even better example might be what's going on, this very week. So some of you may have caught on the news that the Malaysian airliner, the MH370 search that you hear so much about, that it's now gotten to the point where a lot of international organizations are starting to look at requiring some sort of tracking continuously in the air. There were reasons that we haven't done this up to this point. It's expensive, etc. However, when this accident happened and we started looking for this plane, we started to realize that we were getting data we didn't even know that we were getting, and that it was actually possible to at least figure out what track the aircraft was on for some of its flight. And so this ability now has taken center stage. So this disaster has pushed some innovation that we didn't really even know that we were doing. These satellite companies weren't really thinking of using their data necessarily in that way. So now, because of that accident, it looks like it may very well be a reality in the very near future that all international airliners that are on these transoceanic flights are going to be monitored that way. So hopefully there should never be another situation where an airliner just disappears like this and can't be found. We're going to rip from the headlines, but that's really an important case of how things are changing. So besides disasters, the other thing that seems to really have pushed innovation in this field, and in a lot of fields, of course, is war. And so when World War II breaks out, we see a lot of significant innovations in navigation technology that we use today. Radio navigation, you can go back to, in the air, you can go back to World War I. The German Zeppelins wanted to bomb England, so they were the first users of radio navigation signals for aircraft to try and do that. One of the challenges that came out of the World War II era that's kind of interesting was the fact that a navigator before World War II was a pretty specialized profession. There were a handful of navigators who could navigate an aircraft long distance before World War II. I mean, we're talking, say, in the United States, maybe 36 people that could do that with any real skill using a sextant, so forth. Of course, during World War II, you needed tens of thousands of people to do that job. So, of course, what are we doing? We're training tens of thousands of essentially teenagers, right, 18, 19-year-olds, to do this. And you're going to give them 6 weeks of training, whereas before that, people would have had many months of training to do that kind of job. And so you're going to turn these guys loose, these 18, 19-year-olds loose after having 6 weeks of training in this, and expect them to do navigation that would have given Charles Lindbergh pause, just a few years earlier. Sometimes it didn't end very well. So the picture that we're seeing on the screen here is the most famous ghost airplane, as they call it, of World War II, called the Lady Be Good. This is an airplane that overflew its base on the North African coast by 400 miles and just went into the Saharan desert. And the crew survived the crash, but they spent the next week or so basically dying of thirst out in the open desert, and nobody found them for over a decade. And why did that happen? Well, it was some sort of navigational error, and they suspect, based upon the logs that were found in the aircraft, that the navigator just really didn't have a good idea what was going on. So one of the big things that comes out of this era is the idea of automation, to use computers to simplify the process. So this is, Today when you use your smartphone to find your way in town, you're using a lot of technology, a lot of computer power to do something that before would have been a pretty sophisticated task, right? If you're out in the open country and you're using your GPS, before, how would you have done that? Could you have used a sextant? Let's say you're out in the desert. Could you use a sextant to have figured out your position? Maybe with a lot of training and a lot of experience you could have done it, but now, all you have to do is hit the on button and there you are. So the ability to use computers, that kind of technology, has really been pushed by warfare. And of course, the GPS, when you get down to what the GPS system was supposed to do, when it was conceived back in the 60s, it was supposed to make nuclear missiles get from their submarine launchers to their targets. I mean, that's really what the system at its core was all about. Of course, we use GPS for a lot more than that, but a lot of our key technologies today were defined by that military application. Of course, today, even though we have these fantastic tools like GPS, there's a lot of limitations to what they can do, right? If you've lost your keys in your house, where are they? GPS doesn't tell you where your keys are. Even if you attach a GPS unit to those keys, it's not going to tell you where they are because the GPS signals don't go through the roof of the house. So how are you going to figure out where those glasses are? Which kind of brings up an interesting point. So we're actually at a big transition. I mentioned in the past that it was governments and militaries that were really pushing the envelope. That's actually starting to change now. And one area where we can see that is with the cell phone companies. Right now, the cell phone companies are pushing navigation that's far more accurate and capable than anything the government is doing, either for the military or for airlines. So it's really you, the average person, that's in some ways really kind of pushing the envelope. So let's say, for instance, farmers today, right? The farmer, when they're plowing their field, they want to be able to put their seed with their combine or whatever type of machine they're using. They want to be able to put it at the bottom of the furrow, and they want it to be matched to the type of pesticide they put down. To be able to do that accurately for every single spot on the field, they want to be able to determine where they are to about an inch or a couple centimeters. GPS, as it was built for the military, it's good to about a meter now. So that's plenty good for the soldier in the field. The soldier in the field doesn't care if they have better than a meter accuracy. The pilot doesn't need better than a meter accuracy. They can put an airplane on the runway on an autopilot with a meter accuracy. However, the farmer, he wants 2 centimeters accuracy. So we're seeing kind of a shift. We've gone from the sailor at sea or the pilot in the air working for the government, essentially, being the one that needs these new navigational capabilities, to now the farmer in the field is really kind of pushing the envelope. A really good example of the challenges that we have and the question now of who gets to do the innovation and who's going to make the difference is the firefighter. So the firefighter that we see here, these guys, it's not at all like you see on TV. And this picture that I'm showing you is just a training exercise. In real life, it's much, much worse than this, right? So when these firefighters go into a burning building, it's not at all like it is on TV. The temperatures about chest height are probably 450, 500 degrees. These guys can't stand up. So everything they do, they're crawling around on their hands and knees. The smoke is going to be so thick that they get 18 inches in front of their face. And you might think that the fire chief, when they show up at the scene's got a set of blueprints of the building. That's almost never the case. So these guys are going into a building they've never been in before. They're maybe going to try and rescue somebody that's trapped somewhere. And they're crawling around on their hands and knees on the floor, can't see more than 18 inches in front of their face. How do they get around? I mean, the way they do it today, basically the fire chief kind of listens to what they're saying and is really hand draws on a whiteboard with a set of markers what the guys are telling him, and from that, hopefully he gets enough information to start to try and guide them. But a lot of times it's not accurate, and so this really creates a problem. So I think we've got a question up here. How do you think we should guide these guys in a burning building? And this is an open question. It's an answer that's not fully been solved yet. So to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to show you a picture here of this is a Deputy Chief John Sullivan up in the Worcester, Massachusetts Fire Department. And in 1999, he responded to a fire with the rest of his company. They were going into a warehouse, and they thought there were some people that were homeless people that were living in this warehouse. So this warehouse is going up. They think there's people trapped in there, so they send a couple firefighters in to try and locate them. Those guys get lost and call for help. So they send another team of 2 firefighters in to go try find them. They get lost. Send another team of 2 firefighters to go and find them. And unfortunately, the structure comes down and kills all 6 of these firefighters. So it was a huge tragedy. And this John Sullivan that you see on the screen, he was there on that scene, and he made it his personal mission in life to make sure that never happened again. And so he approached some professors that were there at Worcester Polytechnic University down the street and said, how can we keep this from happening again? What's the solution here to navigating inside a building? You can't use GPS because GPS doesn't penetrate the roof or the sides of the building. And so they've started working on a whole series of methods to try and correct that problem, so the firefighters can, even without having a blueprint of the building, be able to at least find their way back out and kind of map the building as they go. The cell phone companies now are trying to do the same sort of thing, where your smartphone will actually survey wireless access points. It uses a kind of a form of inertial navigation to figure out where it is, and create a highly accurate picture of the internal environment of the store. And retailers, of course, want to do the same thing, right? They want to be able to send you a coupon based upon which aisle you're walking down at the store. They want to know which shelf you're actually looking at, and they would like to send you a coupon for what's on that shelf to encourage you to buy something. And so this is the kind of the world that we're moving towards right now. And of course, the big thing that you in particular are going to be dealing with in the coming decades is automation, right? You've probably seen a lot about driverless cars. Google actually has these cars out in California and Nevada that are legally allowed to run around on the road without a driver at the controls. They can stop at stoplights, merge into traffic. They do all that entirely on their own. The technology is there to allow them to do that. The big questions is what do you do with the insurance? Who's at fault in an accident? These are big questions that go along with just the technology. So it's not just a simple question of how do you invent a way of these things finding their way around. It's how do you do it not only safely, but how do you do it in, what's the legal requirements for doing it? Who insures it? Can you drink and drive if the robot is doing the driving? Are you at fault then? There's a lot of big questions that society has to answer in response to this. Think about, you've probably heard about this Amazon delivery drone idea that's been put out there a lot. Think about that for a second. It's easy enough to tell the drone with GPS where to go, but to have it not run into power lines or your chimney or your neighbor or crash through your window in the process, that's a whole different set of technologies to be able to do that. And to be able to put those technologies on a little drone where it's affordable enough to deliver things with it, that's a whole nother question. And to be able to put all those things onto a drone that's light enough to be able to still carry a package, but also not be so heavy that if it falls out of the sky, that it's going to flatten your car if it lands on it. So these are really kind of big questions, and they're ones that that your generation in particular is going to have to deal with. They are 10, 20, 30 years out. These are really kind of fundamental questions. So this robot that we see on the screen, that technology is here now. We can build a robot. We can make him do a lot of stuff. But how does he do it so that he doesn't break other things? How does he get through a building to find somebody that's injured? So these are questions that have not been fully answered. So we can make him lift the blocks out of the way to find somebody, but we can't necessarily get him to the right spot. So a lot of open questions there, and this is really going to be what's setting the stage here. So a lot of important questions have been answered with things like GPS, but a whole nother set of problems have come up. And a lot of the big questions are not just simply inventing a new technology. It's actually being able to have the society and culture accept that new technology. So driverless cars, it's one thing to build them. It's a whole other thing to get them onto the road. So a lot of different questions here, and it's not just science and technology. It's dealing with the law. It's dealing with politics. It's dealing with ethics. All those things have to be considered.
Wonderful, thank you. There's so many questions that are just popping up as you're going through different areas of this. I think you summarized very well that it touches on a lot of issues of what it is to just be a person in society these days. It's no longer removed just the sailors or just the military. We now have GPS in our pockets, and where's it going to go from there? As you talked about all the things that are tied into GPS, I can't help but wonder, are there any alternatives out there if GPS does go down? You talked about its vulnerability. Are there technologies that the infrastructure just hasn't been built yet, or?
Right. Well, so yeah, there's a couple things. The military, for instance, and the military, of course, has been hyper aware of these problems because since GPS is able to be jammed, we can pretty much assume that any enemy, that's one of the first things that they would do. So inertial navigation is a technology that's been around for really since the 1950s, and that's a technology that's becoming lighter, cheaper, more accurate. Inertial technology is basically just using gyroscopes and accelerometers to kind of figure out how you're moving and then compute a position based on it. So it's not using any radio signals. It's completely isolated from outside signals. That's the big advantage. The disadvantage is that errors creep into that over time. So traditionally, you haven't been able to operate accurately for more than, say, an hour in an airplane or other type of vehicle. Submarines maybe a little bit longer. And so you can have that as a short-term substitute, but it's not really a long-term substitute. The big push right now is to have things that use a lot of different information. Like I mentioned, the cell phone companies, they're trying to have your smartphone and you wouldn't be able to tell what's going on. It might use inertial, it might use triangulation from cell towers, it might use GPS signals, it might use triangulation from wireless access points. So it's going to pull huge amounts of data in and then compare that to some sort of database that it's going to communicate with, and then try and create a position. Very complicated technology. This is really kind of amazing stuff to do this. I mean, very complicated programming to figure all that stuff out. But that's one way it's happening. Another way, create backup systems that are really kind of reliable. We used to have a navigation system in this country before GPS called LORAN that came out of World War II, and it was a fairly accurate system. It wasn't as good as GPS, but the advantage was you couldn't jam it. It's pretty much jam proof. Unfortunately, we in the United States turned off our LORAN transmitters about a little less than 10 years ago. And we did it because we said, hey, we got GPS, that's great. We don't need this other thing. Well, now you see in England and United Kingdom in particular, they've actually taken that old technology and pulled it back out because they're saying, GPS really is too easy to jam. We've got to have a backup. So the British are kind of going the opposite way than what we were doing, and they're pulling this kind of older technology back out of the closet and putting it back into service as a backup. So these are questions that haven't been resolved. Air traffic control is another big area where we've depended upon radar as the way of knowing where airplanes are for a long time, but we're moving to a new system called NextGen, and the idea that what NextGen is using is essentially radios in the airplane that broadcast out their GPS position rather than relying on the radar on the ground. Well, that's much more accurate than radar for a variety of reasons. But again, the question is, what do you do if you have somebody that doesn't want to be seen, right? Or again, some sort of jamming or interference is another factor. The really big question that's concerning a lot of people in the aviation world today are this idea everybody wants to use a drone. And the whole idea that we've used for many, many years now in air traffic control and keeping aircraft separate is this idea of see and avoid, that you either see the opposite aircraft with your eyes or you see them on radar. And so if you're not doing that anymore, you're using a GPS-based system, then what happens? So these are some of the questions that we're working on.
So it sounds like the trend then is towards blending the technology then, instead of just finding the magic bullet and that one thing
Exactly.
that will solve it all.
Absolutely. And I think that the people that are working on this today would say it just like you said it, that really there is no one master solution to anything these days. You have to be able to integrate a whole range of separate things. And this is kind of interesting for people that are going into this as a profession, right? Because before you could get in by being an expert in one particular area, but now it's starting to seem like you really have to have a really broad spectrum of different things going in there. So it's really creating a lot of opportunity for people with creative ideas.
That's very cool. Earlier we were talking a little bit about piracy, and I saw the question pop in, how are today's pirates using navigation technology? There's quite a bit more out there.
Right, so this was a big question, when GPS was made public, because people asked the question, well, our enemies can use it too. People that want to do bad things can use it as well. So what do we do about that? And so essentially there were people that debated this quite a bit, and ultimately the decision was made that the public good of allowing everybody to use it outweighed the negative results for having people use it illegally. So certainly, anybody that's trying to smuggle something into the country, or terrorists are trying to use these sorts of systems. GPS is the go-to system for the bad guys as well as the good guys. Now, the military does have ways of kind of tilting the playing ground away from those guys. So in a war zone, for instance, the military on the ground is going to have a much better, more accurate signal than the other guys. So there are ways of kind of tweaking it, but it's still very much an issue. It's the trade-off that you have, so that you get some bad with the good, and that's the way with any technology.
It was interesting that you pointed out it was a political maneuver that Reagan decided to release GPS and release that technology. I was curious if that was a historical shift, if before that was navigation technology guarded?
Well, in some sense it was kind of a publicity stunt that, in reality the idea probably would have been that it would have been public anyway. But because Reagan did announce that in the way that he did, it actually kind of forced everybody to think about it sooner, and I think more broadly. Before it was like, okay, GPS is this neat thing, we might be able to do some stuff with it. But people were nervous about investing in it because they didn't know how much control the military was going to have over it. So when Reagan said that, it put everybody's mind at ease, and they said, okay, we know this is going to be a really robust civilian system that we can count on, that the military is not going to be it's not going to be a military-only system that can be shut off at a moment's notice. Now, I mean, and even today, people still around the world still have that fear. Americans don't tend to have that fear because we kind of feel like, okay, our government's not going to turn it off on us. But if you go over to Europe and talk to those guys, there's a lot of people there. They're very concerned about GPS being an American military system, and that we're going to flip the switch off. I really don't think there's any validity to that opinion. It's pretty clear that the military absolutely does not have that as their policy, and that the president can't just on the drop of a hat order that too. There's a lot of protocol set up in place. I mean, it would have to be a pretty serious situation for the president to order the civilian GPS signals to be turned off. I mean, that would have to be, if that's happened, the world's in a very, very bad place, and that's the least of your concerns. So, this is a question that still troubles a lot of people, but I don't think it's one that we have to be worried about.
In a way, I feel like that concern almost parallels our discussion from the first session about deciding where the prime meridian is, which is maybe that people just don't like to let go of that control.
Oh, absolutely.
So if someone else controls the prime meridian, someone else controls the GPS, it's no longer your identity. It's no longer your tradition or under your influence.
Absolutely, and it's a good thing that other countries like China and Russia develop their own satellite navigation systems, especially if they're interoperable with ours, because that means that there's more satellites and more signal, and it's better for everybody. So there's I don't think anybody's really complaining that those countries are going to go in their own way. I don't think they need to be as worried as they are about using the American system, but that's their prerogative to be that way.
And even if it's motivated by worry, it seems to get back to that whole blended technology being the kind of direction it's all going. So
Exactly.
new technologies out there, we'll just add it in.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned a lot of different times where innovation sprung from either disaster or war. I know that a lot of our students that are probably joining us might be more used to the science fair type of example that you gave earlier in the presentation. Can you think of any larger scale examples of kind of science fair extracted to our everyday, maybe non-academic life where that's come about?
Yeah. So there's I think one of the more interesting ones that I've seen recently. There was, and again, it's DARPA is the one that seems to get the most attention, just for the kind of really exotic things that they push. For instance, they just had a competition to create what they called a transformer, which was a vehicle that could basically a car that could become a helicopter and then move around. So there's a lot of things that you could do with that. And there's actually a company that's now gotten to the point where they're flying this thing, and it's got a hull that pops off. It could become a boat or a car, and then it flies, and it's really kind of amazing. And that's not something that if the Pentagon had tried to do that, they would have spent many billions of dollars trying to get as far as they did. So you have to have some sort of incentive to have these competitions. And so there's what will happen is these little companies. It's usually not the big defense contractors. They don't see enough money in it to mess with these kind of competitions. But the smaller companies, the ones that have the really creative innovators, are the ones that respond to these kind of cash prizes and go out there and invent these really unusual things that would never otherwise get invented because it's too risky for a big company to get involved with working on those kinds of things. That and they just don't see enough profit in it to do it. So you need some sort of kind of clever to get people to work on these kind of projects. That's very much like a science fair competition. And like I said, I think if you look at what goes on in colleges in particular, engineering departments, pretty much any field that you go into is going to have these kind of really sophisticated technology competitions where it's building a better robot to navigate a disaster course, or it's a flying some sort of flying drone that's designed to go into a building in formation or something. And so there'll be these sorts of competitions that, if nothing else, the people that work on those things are going to be very well prepared for when they go into the workforce. And then, what are they going to be working on? Well, it's these similar sorts of competitions. And so this idea of a competition to create innovation is one it's a very American idea in particular, but it's one that works very well for us. And I think it's one reason that the United States has a competitive edge in a lot of these technology fields is because we have that kind of science fair approach to innovation.
Thank you. I've launched the evaluation button in the top left-hand corner of the screen, and just a reminder to all of you that if this is your last session with us today, please do make sure to click on that. We'd love your feedback. But if you're planning on joining us for the sessions that are coming after this one, then there's no need to click on it yet. We'll launch it again towards the end of the conference. I'd like to just throw out one more question with the last minute or two that we have left here. I was really struck by the photo of the dejected person sitting on the airplane in the middle of the desert. And I'm wondering, they're sitting on all of this technology that's there, and none of it can actually help someone get out of that space. Does that tend to happen with navigation technology, that the other technology advances ahead of it and then navigation has to catch up? Or are there examples of it being the reverse?
Yeah, no, the trend has usually been that we can cross oceans before we can find our way across oceans. That's really what it comes down to. And it's one of those things that the what's the big idea there? The thing that really attracts people's imagination is getting to the other continent. It's not creating a better sextant, right? So the sextant follows after you try to go to the continent and the new continent, you realize how difficult it is, and when you see so many ships being lost, that's when that kind of urgency about the kind of the sub technology starts to come into play. So what's the big idea? Well, the big idea is crossing the ocean, and that's where everybody wants. They want the bigger boat to do that. They want the better airplane. But it's only after that better ship and better airplane tend to get built that somebody realizes, the compass isn't good enough, or we're just not getting our radio signals far enough out, or whatever it is, that somebody then realizes, okay, we've got to do something. And it goes back to that disaster thing. It's usually, unfortunately, a lot of times it's not until people lose their lives that people are willing to spend the money when you get down to it to solve these problems.
It occurs to me that maybe traveling to the moon is one of the examples where it was flipped a little bit more, but maybe there were a lot of blown up test rockets that didn't get as much press along the way.
Well, the getting to the moon was one where you had a very scientific approach. So usually, for kind of the bigger issues of getting global economy and so forth, you don't have quite that focus, that scientific method and focus to it. But even in Apollo, I think you can look at it and say, their approach wasn't when they were navigating to the moon, they didn't know what was going to work best. They said, okay, well, there's multiple ways of doing this. You can look at the stars, you can use radio signals. We're going to do both. We're going to put both in there. Then we're going to figure out what works best, and then we'll do that. But they built the spaceship to go to the moon before they knew exactly which one was going to work best. So, on that, when Apollo 8 made that first, trip actually out towards, orbit around the moon, they were testing both, and what they found was that they both worked. That you could use a sextant in an Apollo capsule between the Earth and the moon, look at the stars and figure out where you were, or you could use the radio signals. But the radio signals were probably easier, maybe even a little bit more accurate. So they said, okay, we don't need the sextant anymore. But it wasn't until they actually made the trip that they had come to that conclusion. So even in that really methodical, very scientific approach to getting from here to there, even there, the spacecraft came before they had a definite answer on the navigational technology.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Hey, I think it's clear that a lot of this is still evolving. There's a lot of space for creativity, and some of the things you were describing sound more like science fiction than a reality, and it's very cool to hear that they're either on the cusp of becoming realities or they are already being tested and incorporated into pre-existing technology. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was really a wonderful session.
Thank you, Adam.
And for all of you who are there with us online, we will be back with you in just about 7 minutes with our next session. Once again, I'll leave that evaluation link up on the screen for you, but we'll be going off the air for just 7 minutes, and we'll be back with you soon. Thank you.